Welcome to the Lake Forest Podcast, a podcast about the lovely city of Lake Forest, featuring topics like local news, sports, music, people, food, and history. My name is Pete, and I'm joined with my co-host, Arthur Miller, who's having another art class. I got to hurry up and talk before Art gets in here because he's pretty strict on when class starts, hands folded and quiet, cell phones on the desks. We all live in Lake Forest. Okay, before we start our class, we have a sponsor for the show, Dakota Insurance Group. They've got your back. Why? Because that's what friends are for. Dakota Insurance handles all your residential and commercial needs. Get a quote now at dakotaInsuranceGroup.com. Okay, one of the goals of the podcast is to help our listeners learn a little bit more about Lake Forest. And then, well, who better to teach us than Lake Forest's own history guru, Arthur Miller. Okay, everyone take your seats, fold your hands quickly on top of the desk. Our class is about to begin. Art, how you been, buddy?
Just fine. Thank you, Pete. So I'm for this particular talk, I am both historian and historic. I was literally born, a year before D-Day. My memories of that are somewhat vague, as you can imagine.
Oh, really?
Don't remember much, but I grew up in the shadow of all those events and people who've been involved in them, and also have been aware of Lake Forest history, and Lake Forest College history, both of which relate a lot to Lake Forest, the town of Lake Forest, but they don't. Interestingly enough, there's only passing reference to people being involved in the actual D-Day invasion. And that sort of highlights a point that is interesting, that's different from today. We're aware of situations that involve one country, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, or the Gulf War with Kuwait and Iraq, and then Iraq again, and Afghanistan. These are sort of limited theaters of warfare, major warfare. What was going on in 1942 to the middle of 1945 was basically the whole world was taken up in these struggles. Across East Asia, into South Asia, over to the European theater, which went clear from Russia into North Africa, which wasn't exactly Europe, but I mean, all the continents were pretty much involved. And soldiers from every continent, including Australia, took part. So D-Day was one of the most remarkable points because it was the pulling together of forces in Britain to stage the attack, starting in 1943, under General Eisenhower, organized to invade France, to push back the Germans into their own territory. The challenge was that the English Channel was not an easy, it wasn't easy to make a trip across the channel. And to have an invasion force, it would be very similar to attacking Lake Forest Beach or Fort Sheridan, where 30 years ago or so they did a reenactment of the D-Day invasion at Fort Sheridan. Lots of people showed up, including us. And those tall bluffs made for difficult beach head, because you had, from the top of the bluff, you had a pretty good view of everybody trying to land, and you could pick them off. There were giant concrete pillboxes that were stationed along the coast, that were where machine guns were inside, only with little slits for the bullets to go out. It was a terrifically difficult thing to contemplate. So it looms in memory because it was such an underdog undertaking, even by the United States and English and all the other forces that were part of the D-Day invasion. Mostly it was divided up into different beaches between different groups. The US had certain beaches like Omaha. The British had other points that were there they were at. And Omaha Beach is memorable because it was just, the devastation was terrific. The people were chewed up. They never got off of their landing craft sometimes, even though they were trying to bomb them from the shore with shells and everything. It was too difficult. So my personal experience of it was, when I was about 20, I was studying in the town just to the south of Omaha Beach, which was called Caen, which is Caen in Normandy. It was the major city related to that area where the railroads came together and things like that. So I came from Kalamazoo College, and they had more students than they had dormitory space. So they came up with a brilliant idea that they would send all the students abroad in their junior year, unless they had a doctor's excuse, because they had no beds for them. So they would then bring in other classes and do it. So I was sent abroad. In those days, it was cheaper to send people by ship for 8 to 10 days than by airplane. Airplane was elitist in 1963 when I went. So we went by ship. And so it gave me a little understanding of crossing the North Atlantic, which was not exactly easy. So the United States was involved in supporting all this stuff. They brought material over. It was a bunch of American material that largely did the invasion. But the problem was that just the sheer scale of it and the advantage of the Germans being in their fortified positions up above, it just compounded anything you imagine from the Middle Ages or like that. So along about December of that year, when I'd gone over and landed in about September of 1963, I was giving American English lessons to a French kid that was at the University of Caen, where I was. He wanted American business language. He was a real up and comer and was interested. And so I gave him lessons, and we kind of bartered, and he would take me and a few friends or other students up to Omaha Beach for a tour. So it was myself. My father had been 4F and had bad vision and couldn't get into any part of the war. So he did kind of war work in industry. My birth announcement in 1943 was in the form of a ration card, which was the standard thing that everybody had. We're now talking about our vaccine forms, that we had. Yeah. Back then it was a ration card. So every crisis has its paperwork. And the other people in the group was a young woman whose father had been in the invasion. And one of the other international students that was our friend was a German kid. And his dad had been on the defense side. And this kid that I was giving the language lessons to, the French kid, he was French. His family had a lovely 2-story cottage at the shore in Normandy that happened to be Omaha Beach. And the next day, he was found in a blanket at 6 months old, hanging from a 2nd-story window, the only wall left from that beach house. So he was raised by his aunts in Caen and was fine, but he'd never known his parents because they were killed when he was 6 months old. So it was interesting to have all these different points of view at once about the battle. And it was very poignant for the people who've been involved in some way personally. And so I guess I'm historic because here I am 55 years later or so, or more, 58 years, I guess, telling the story about what that was like, just to make that little visit with these people. And at the time, I thought of D-Day as ancient history because I was 20 years old. And when you're 20, anything before what you remember is could be, the Greeks at the Peloponnesian War or something like that. Or
it'd be September 11th is 20 years, right?
Yeah. And so kids born since then, that's ancient history. So now, of course, I see France the way it was when I arrived as being basically post-war. I lived, the family I stayed with when I was there at the university lived on a bluff just outside the main town. They had a big old 3-story house, and on the top floor was a ballroom. And they wanted to bring in some students, partly for income, partly just for interest from America. And they were dividing, as we arrived in late September, in the evening after dinner in the city, there were workmen still at work, finishing off, filling bullet holes from 1944 in the ballroom. And so the room that I was in had been attacked 20 years earlier, you know. It was pretty interesting, or 19 years earlier. So you had a sense of something having happened that was pretty momentous. But the little group I was with from Kalamazoo College, Kalamazoo had hired a professor there, a lycée professor, high school, early college equivalent professor, Monsieur Entz. And Monsieur Entz was a quiet little guy, very helpful, very nice, very cordial, invited us to his home. He organized us, made sure that we were all okay. Years later, I found out that he was a major figure in the resistance. Because of his very unassuming nature and being small, he was not too tall. He could pass for an adolescent pedaling along on his bicycle. So he would pedal past the German headquarters in Caen. He sent the British information about where to put the airfield for their invasion and to deploy forces into the town. And this little quiet guy lived into his mid-90s. We corresponded with him a little bit later, but I had some good friends from then. My wife and I had good friends that went back and visited him a few years just before his death. And it was incredible. He was like a national treasure. And he helped plan the D-Day invasion museum that's there and everything. So it's always hard to tell when you're in the middle of history what really is going on, you know. It's really unusual. So there was a book done by Lake Forest College by Francis Beidler II. Francis Beidler II was the grandson of Jacob Beidler, who'd been an early supporter of Lake Forest College, built a building in 1890, big lumber guy in Chicago, Pennsylvania German background. But Francis Beidler II lived on Stonegate, and then in 1942 moved to Walden Lane down in the southeast part of Lake Forest into a beautiful house. But he was very much committed with Lake Forest College and worked with the kids that were getting ready to go abroad, trained them before the war actually started in 41, and then worked with them when they were, then the college, with all the students gone, the very resourceful president arranged with the national government to send 400 students in 1943 who'd been drafted out of college. And they didn't have anything to do with them because they hadn't really gotten their act together yet. They weren't ready for the invasions. So they put these kids at Lake Forest College, 400 guys. They studied engineering, they studied stuff. They were told they were studying for officer preparation. Actually, they were just being stockpiled like any other military supplies for the 1944 invasions. Half went to the European theater, half went to the Pacific theater. The European theater guys, almost, as far as I can tell, none of them died at D-Day. A lot of them died later after D-Day, so they must have been in the invasion. But they were normal casualties. They came in the south of France. They were in different places. And they fought in eastern France, which was pretty rough when the Germans were trying to hold them back later in the year. But the main group, the 200 that went to the Pacific, were decimated at Leyte in the Philippines and Okinawa. And I only met one survivor of that group, Arthur D. Dubin of Highland Park. He was the son of an architect. He was drafted, sent down to New Orleans. And they told him, well, they were going to send him for some further training to a little college up north that nobody knew about called Lake Forest College. And he said, Lake Forest College, That's 3 stops on the North Shoreline from where I grew up. So he was happy. He was being dropped home. And he was there through 1943, studied hard, but then he went over and he was one of the survivors of that Pacific group. He was a medic. In one battle on Okinawa, his parents found out about his being in the battle by him being reported in the Chicago Tribune for valor, saving some guys, you know, who'd been under fire and everything like that. So he died in 2011, but he had great stories about it. And he was representative of this group. There was a little basketball team, intramural basketball team. The winners in 1943, the fall of 1943 from this basketball team, before they got shipped out, there were 9 guys. At least half of them were dead within 2 years. These were like kids 19, 20, something like that. Half of them were dead within 2 years. A couple others of them were wounded. One, nobody knows what happened to him. But this group was just decimated in World War II. It's hard for us to realize that. And probably the worst, the most compelling battle like that we think about is D-Day. And one of the most interesting things to visit is the cemetery there. Very respectful cemetery with white marble crosses, rows and rows of crosses of kids that maybe got off of the boat, maybe got up on the beach, maybe got into the barbed wire, maybe made it past the barbed wire, maybe made it to the cliff, maybe even got up to where they could throw something into the pillbox like a grenade, but didn't make it. And it's just awesome to remember. Very difficult. Yes.
Art, hand
Yes.
up in the back of the class.
Yes.
This area, didn't we train a lot of naval aviators because of Lake Michigan and the aircraft carrier? I don't know if that was on the Pacific side more than.
There was a lot of preparation here, and one of the early theories about having the naval base at Great Lakes, which is just north of Chicago, having Fort Sheridan used like that, having Glenview Naval Air Station. Chicago was in the middle of the country. It was the headquarters of America First, which is basically keeping America out of World War II. They were more frightened of the Germans, more frightened of the Russians and Stalin than they were of Hitler. And so they had to feel like there was a real war on, and they were part of it. Remember, planes couldn't fly very far at that point. Right. Supposing a German plane got as far to got as far west as the East Coast and bombed New York City, from the point of view of conservative Midwesterners, they were still protected. There was no way Hitler was getting across the Allegheny Mountains to bomb Chicago. So you have to picture the world was an entirely different place at that time. So all these kind of training efforts were partly public relations to keep on the front page of the paper, the Tribune, Daily News, stuff like that. The pictures of the aircraft carriers, kids practicing aircraft carrier landings, sailors being trained at Great Lakes, soldiers being trained at Fort Sheridan, airplane pilots being trained in Glenview. This was all a combination. It was partly theater, it was partly real. They were training people, but they were training them here to keep the Chicagoans aware that there was a danger to the United States. There wasn't really any commitment to being involved in that European theater until Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And so the European theater was still, there was an ambivalence about, if you got rid of Hitler, what was going to stop Stalin? And that led to the Cold War that went on until 1990. So what we see when we see pictures of all that, or people bring up history about the training during World War II, that was to make sure that the Lake Foresters realized that America was under attack, not just from the Pacific, but also from the Atlantic. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yep.
So we had, as I said, there were a couple of these guys who were in the invasion that went on to be one of the young men that's listed in this book by Francis Bider II, put out in 1950 by Lake Forest College. He had been in one of the 3 tanks that had led the movement away from the beach. Can you imagine that? He survived that, but it finally caught up with him. Fate finally caught up with him further into France, past Paris, on the way into Germany, because the Germans fought brutally to stop the Americans from crossing the Rhine, getting into their territory, crossing Belgium, that sort of thing. So people died in Belgium, people died eastern France a lot, before they actually caved in and let people get across the river. And then pretty soon, by April, I guess it was, of 1944, Hitler was didn't give up, but committed suicide. So D-Day is kind of where we've just had Memorial Day, and we remember these sacrifices, but D-Day was both a tremendous sacrifice, but it also was one of the major military memorable battles of history. I certainly wasn't aware of that in 1963. I was just going, big battle, yada, yada, yada. But, Napoleon at Waterloo, his defeat there, big battles that had happened in the past, the going back to the Romans and the Greeks. This battle is just the culmination of all those. And we really haven't had another kind of similar world war, because of what ended the war in the Pacific was the atomic bomb. Arthur Dubin, who survived Philippine battles with kamikazes, Okinawa battles with kamikazes, was sure he would die in the invasion of Japan. He and others. There's an historian whose name is escaping me right now, who was in the similar situation, and they estimated that there might be 1 million casualties attacking Japan. That didn't mean dead people, but it meant wounded as well as dead. But there might have been, over 100,000 people killed just trying to overcome, bring down the Japanese Empire that wouldn't give up, and everybody would die rather than be taken. So Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb, which was horrible, and still.
Well, how long did he know about the bomb? Right, FDR passed away, and then by the way, we got this.
They never told him. He never got the. So he was completely in the dark, and then they told him all this stuff had been going on. The University of Chicago. My late friend Franz Schultz used to play pickup football at Stagg Field, and the University of Chicago didn't realize they were splitting the atom underneath the grandstand, in 1942, 43. So all this stuff was going on, and but all entirely kept secret. They didn't have an internet to hack, so that made it easier.
But they did hack those code breakers,
Yeah, we didn't. Right. That helped us a lot with the code breakers. But dropping those atomic bombs finally got the Japanese to give up. And there'd been carpet bombing of Tokyo and everything also, and it hadn't done the job. So the president thought that it was important to save American and Allied lives and not have, we didn't start it, we were invaded. So the atomic bomb was a way of clearing out that thing. But it brought a stalemate that lasted from 1945 until 1990 or so, when the Berlin Wall came down. And it molded a lot of what older generations have think about, that period. So D-Day is emblematic of that. It's emblematic of courage that people had. They call it the greatest generation. But it was logistically also just a triumph, because Dwight D. Eisenhower managed it well. He had a fake buildup of stuff in a different part of England, so that the Germans might think the invasion was going to come further north. And he had plywood tanks and stuff all lined up.
Inflatables.
Yeah.
Art, should also give probably credit to, and this is getting beyond Lake Forest, but, the George Marshall, if he didn't have a plan to rebuild all that stuff, that could have all fallen apart, right?
Well, the Russians came right in, and there was a race between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians got to Berlin and passed before we could catch up with them, because there had been such German resistance in the west of Germany. So there was a big problem. They didn't want Europe to go communist. Now, in the French government, there was a strong communist faction that after the war, there was a strong worker movement, and the worker labor movement in France is still very strong, as opposed to this country. That's why they have 6-week vacations. They get 2 hours for lunch, things like that. And one prime minister once in France I guess it was about the 80s, said, "We don't care if we have crappy cars. We get 2 hours for lunch." So it's a better.
And then they wonder why their GDP isn't as high as it could be.
That's right. But so the United States was pretty worried in the Cold War period that if they left this just a mess, Germany left it a mess, left France a mess, that the society would deteriorate, just like it had in Russia after the initial revolution in March of 1917. The chaos led to the rise of the Bolsheviks. And they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to hand the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, a chance to do that again. So they invested American dollars. That's what kept the taxes high into the 60s. Income taxes stayed confiscatory for rich people into the 1960s, so that they could rebuild places over there. So we rebuilt German industry. We rebuilt schools and everything in France and factories. As a result, by the 1980s, 90s, we'd be rebuilt Japan. So what was killing American industry? American cars were being built in 1900, 1910 factories, and German cars were being built in 1940s, 50s factories. Japanese cars were being built in 1940s, 50s factories, built by us. And then they would undercut us for cars when they shipped them over here. So the American car industry went into a big decline that really didn't get reversed until after the 2008 recession, where the feds pumped money into the auto industry. That helped a lot. So we helped save. What we did was we kept it from going communist, which would have been worse for Americans than, at least the upper class Americans, than Hitler. So Hitler was a right-wing movement, and that was the elite classes that led in Hitler's. They initially didn't like him because he was kind of a grubby guy, but they saw what he was uniting the people. He was a populist, and so they've gotten back behind him. In Russia, the opposite had happened. Everybody who was in the upper class, what they call the intelligentsia, college profs and stuff like that, plus wealthy people, industrialists, and the aristocracy, they were wiped out. A few escaped. They escaped, some of them to Chicago, but they were wiped out. And so the Americans knew that if communism got a good root in Western Europe and challenged the United States, the first folks that were going to go if the communists took over in the United States was not going to be the working class. It was going to be the industrialist owners, the McCormicks, the Armours, the Swifts, people like they were going to be at the top of the list. So they were, not surprisingly, backers of this America First movement that was really saying, we don't like Hitler. He's terrible. They didn't know how terrible yet, but they knew he was terrible. But he's our buffer against Stalin and communism that will completely overthrow our whole way of life.
So we had to pick our poison back then. It was not a real
and,
good no good options.
Yeah, today we face similar kinds of things with China, human rights and stuff like that. And we don't like a lot of the choices. But back then, they were even more up against the wall in making their choices. So the Marshall Plan was a huge victory for the United States in the Cold War because we kept those countries from becoming communist satellites.
Got it. All right, what a great class, man. This is good stuff. You should give out a degree.
Well, the power invested in me by the internet, I hereby grant you
1 course credit.
Yes, exactly.
No, this is great, Art. I can't wait for the next ones. So Sunday, D-Day, we'll put this out on Wednesday, give people time to listen to it. And, when Sunday happens, people, just remember, we've been given a lot of freedoms, a lot of luxuries here. And I know we just got done with Memorial Day, but we got to remember why we have them, right, Art?
Well, it's hard to picture the valor of people who face basically certain death. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're complaining about rationing toilet paper, right?
Or beef.
or beef now. Yeah. Okay. Art, thanks for coming on doing the show again.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a privilege.
And then thanks for listening to the Lake Forest Podcast. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and smash that like button on Facebook, Instagram, and follow us on Twitter. Let us know what you'd like to hear about in the upcoming shows. Again, I'm Pete, and I can be reached at pete@lakeforestpodcast.com. The link will be in the podcast notes below. On behalf of my co-host, Arthur Miller, we thank you for listening. Art class is now over. The bell is ringing.